The pre-dawn darkness of April 16, 1945, lay heavy across the Seelow Heights, where Obergefreiter Heinrich Weber of the 9th Army's Artillery Observation Corps crouched in a reinforced concrete bunker, adjusting his Zeiss rangefinder while scanning the Soviet positions that stretched like a black ocean beyond the Oder River. At 24, Weber had been calling in fire missions for 18 months across the collapsing Eastern Front, from the retreat from Kursk to the desperate defense of the Oder Line, but nothing in his extensive combat experience had prepared him for the magnitude of Soviet preparations that he was documenting in the pre-dawn hours of what would become the final battle for Berlin. The Seelow Heights represented the last major geographical barrier between Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belorussian Front and the German capital, rising nearly 60 meters above the Oder River Valley to provide commanding observation over the approaches to Berlin. The Wehrmacht's 9th Army under General Theodor Busse had spent 3 months fortifying these positions, constructing multiple defensive lines that incorporated every farmhouse, village, and ridge line into an integrated defensive system designed to delay the Soviet advance long enough for political negotiations to end the war on terms more favorable than unconditional surrender. Weber's observation post overlooked the primary Soviet assault sector where the 8th Guards Army and 1st Guards Tank Army had been concentrating forces for the decisive breakthrough operation that would open the road to Berlin. His mission involved directing German artillery fires against Soviet preparations while providing early warning of enemy assault operations. The systematic intelligence gathering had revealed ominous signs of the largest military buildup in history, with over 15 million Soviet troops supported by 6,250 tanks and 41,600 artillery pieces concentrated along a 60-kilometer front. The strategic situation facing the 9th Army in April 1945 reflected the complete collapse of German military power following 4 years of warfare against the Soviet Union. General Busse commanded approximately 100,000 troops organized into the 11 SS Panzer Corps, CI Army Corps, and LVI Panzer Corps, defending positions that represented the final barrier protecting the Reich capital. The Wehrmacht forces lacked adequate ammunition, fuel, and air support necessary to counter major Soviet offensive operations, while the systematic breakdown of German logistics eliminated tactical flexibility that might have compensated for overwhelming material disadvantages. Marshal Zhukov commanded the First Belorussian Front with explicit orders from Stalin to capture Berlin before Western Allied forces could advance from the Elbe River, ensuring Soviet political control over the German capital. The massive concentration of combat power included 8 combined arms armies, 2 tank armies, and 3 air armies supported by over 40,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers. The systematic preparation for Operation Berlin represented the culmination of Soviet military development during 4 years of warfare against German forces. Weber documented the first concrete signs of imminent Soviet attack at 0347 hours when his observation post detected the distinctive sound of Katyusha rocket launchers moving into firing positions approximately 8 kilometers east of his location. The mechanical noise of tracked vehicles and the systematic deployment of multiple rocket launcher battalions suggested that Soviet forces were positioning themselves for the largest artillery preparation in military history. Weber's combat experience enabled him to estimate the scale of Soviet preparations based on movement patterns and equipment deployment observed through his optical instruments. The Soviet First Guards Tank Army, commanded by Colonel General Mikhail Katyusha, represented the primary exploitation force for the Berlin operation, tasked with breakthrough operations against the 9th Army's positions at Seelow Heights before advancing directly toward the German capital. The formation included over 800 T-34/85 medium tanks and IS-3 heavy tanks supported by self-propelled artillery and mechanized infantry. Katyusha was a veteran tank commander who had distinguished himself during the battles of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk, developing tactical expertise in large-scale armored operations that would prove decisive during the breakthrough phase of the Berlin operation. The German defensive positions at Seelow Heights reflected 8 months of continuous fortification efforts, with multiple defensive lines connected by communication trenches and protected by extensive minefields and anti-tank obstacles. The 9th Army sector included reinforced bunkers, artillery observation posts, and carefully positioned Panzerfaust teams that provided overlapping fields of fire across all likely Soviet approach routes. However, the defensive works were manned by a mixture of regular Wehrmacht units, Volkssturm militia, and hastily trained foreign volunteers whose combat effectiveness varied dramatically. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner commanded the artillery observation section responsible for coordinating defensive fires across the Seelow Heights sector, directing the 9th Army's remaining artillery assets against Soviet preparations and eventual assault operations. Steiner was a veteran officer who had served with artillery units since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, accumulating extensive experience in fire direction and target analysis during 4 years of continuous combat on the Eastern Front. His professional assessment of Soviet preparations suggested that German forces faced assault by overwhelming enemy strength that exceeded anything previously encountered. The systematic Soviet buildup along the Oder River had been proceeding for 6 weeks, with Marshal Zhukov's forces establishing massive supply dumps, artillery parks, and troop concentrations that dwarfed previous military operations. The First Belorussian Front included over 3,000 trucks carrying ammunition, 1,500 tanks awaiting the assault order, and countless artillery pieces positioned wheel-to-wheel along the entire front. The mathematical concentration of combat power represented the largest single military force assembled in European history. Weber's observation post had been monitoring Soviet preparations continuously since early March, documenting the systematic arrival of artillery units, tank formations, and assault troops that confirmed intelligence estimates about the scale of impending operations. His reports to the 9th Army's intelligence section described precisely positioned rocket launcher battalions, concealed tank assembly areas, and forward ammunition dumps that suggested preparations for sustained offensive operations lasting several weeks. The accumulated evidence painted a picture of Soviet capabilities that exceeded German defensive resources by overwhelming margins. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Müller, commanding the Seelow Heights Artillery Regiment, had been attempting to coordinate counter-battery fires against detected Soviet gun positions, but the overwhelming numerical superiority of enemy artillery made effective suppression impossible. The German forces possessed approximately 600 artillery pieces in the entire 9th Army sector, compared to over 41,600 Soviet guns and rocket launchers concentrated for the Berlin operation. The mathematical disparity eliminated any possibility of achieving fire superiority or effectively disrupting Soviet preparations. The technical challenge facing German artillery operations reflected broader problems affecting Wehrmacht logistics during the final phase of the war. The shortage of ammunition had reduced German guns to firing quotas of 10 rounds per day, while fuel rationing limited movement and repositioning necessary for effective counter-battery operations. The systematic breakdown of German supply systems had created tactical conditions that favored Soviet offensive operations while eliminating Wehrmacht defensive advantages. Weber documented additional signs of imminent attack when Soviet reconnaissance aircraft began systematic photographic missions over German positions at 0430 hours. The Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik aircraft operated with complete impunity due to the absence of effective German air defense, enabling detailed observation of Wehrmacht defensive preparations and identification of high-value targets. The aerial reconnaissance provided Soviet commanders with comprehensive intelligence about German capabilities that would be exploited during the artillery preparation and assault operations. The Luftwaffe's remaining forces in the Berlin sector consisted of fewer than 300 operational aircraft opposing over 7,500 Soviet planes assigned to support the offensive. The overwhelming enemy air superiority eliminated German reconnaissance capabilities while providing close air support for Red Army ground operations. The systematic destruction of German air power during the previous 3 years had created tactical conditions that enabled Soviet forces to operate without effective air opposition. Oberst Hans Krebs, commanding the 9th Army's intelligence section, received fragmentary reports from subordinate units throughout the early morning hours, recognizing that his forces faced assault by the largest military concentration in history. Krebs was a veteran intelligence officer who had served in senior staff positions throughout the Eastern Front campaign, but his professional assessment suggested that German defensive positions could not withstand coordinated attack by the massive Soviet forces assembled along the Oder River. The breakdown of German intelligence capabilities during the final phase of the war reflected broader problems affecting Wehrmacht operations throughout the collapsing Reich. The destruction of experienced reconnaissance units, elimination of effective air support, and systematic disruption of communication networks had created intelligence gaps that prevented accurate assessment of Soviet capabilities and intentions. The German intelligence failure contributed directly to unrealistic defensive planning that underestimated the scale of enemy preparations. Weber observed the final preparations for Soviet assault operations at 0445 hours when enemy forces began moving assault troops into forward positions under cover of elaborate camouflage and deception measures. The systematic movement of infantry, engineers, and supporting weapons suggested that Soviet commanders were implementing carefully rehearsed procedures for river crossing operations and breakthrough tactics developed during 4 years of warfare against German forces. The professional competence displayed by Red Army units contrasted sharply with the confused defensive preparations evident in German positions. The 3rd Shock Army, assigned to the initial assault across the Oder River at Seelow Heights, included 4 experienced rifle corps supported by engineer battalions, assault guns, and the largest concentration of artillery in military history. The formation had participated in previous breakthrough operations at Stalingrad, Kursk, and the destruction of Army Group Center, accumulating tactical expertise in river crossing operations and urban warfare that would prove decisive during the Berlin operation. The German Ninth Army's defensive plan called for destroying Soviet forces during their crossing attempt and initial assault, using overlapping fields of fire from prepared positions to create killing zones that would delay enemy advance while inflicting maximum casualties. However, the plan depended on maintaining adequate ammunition supplies and effective communication between defensive positions, prerequisites that had been systematically eliminated by Soviet preparatory operations and German logistical collapse. Hauptmann Steiner recognized at 0500 hours that his artillery regiment faced systematic destruction when Soviet counter-battery fires began targeting German gun positions with precision that indicated comprehensive intelligence about Wehrmacht defensive preparations. The enemy's ability to locate and engage individual German artillery pieces suggested extensive reconnaissance and possibly signals intelligence that had identified every significant defensive position. Steiner's professional judgment indicated that effective German resistance would be impossible against such overwhelming enemy capabilities. The Soviet artillery preparation commenced at exactly 0500 hours on April 16, 1945, when over 41,600 guns and rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously across the entire First Belorussian Front sector. The thunderous bombardment created seismic effects that registered on instruments in Scandinavia as high-explosive shells systematically destroyed German defensive positions that had been identified through weeks of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Weber's observation post disappeared in the opening salvo as Soviet gunners demonstrated the mathematical precision that resulted from extensive preparation and target analysis. The Katyusha rocket launchers that Weber had observed moving into position delivered devastating salvos against German command posts, communication centers, and reserve positions identified through intelligence gathering. The BM-13 and BM-31 rocket launchers fired thousands of high-explosive rockets in concentrated volleys that created psychological as well as physical effects among German defenders. The systematic deployment of rocket artillery represented Soviet recognition that firepower concentration could substitute for tactical finesse in breakthrough operations. Weber survived the initial bombardment by taking shelter in the deepest section of his reinforced observation bunker, but the systematic destruction of German positions eliminated any possibility of effective fire direction or communication with artillery units. The Ninth Army's communication systems disintegrated under the sustained Soviet bombardment, while German artillery positions were systematically located and destroyed by counter-battery fires directed with unprecedented precision. The artillery preparation for the Berlin operation continued for 35 minutes with mathematical intensity, as Soviet batteries delivered pre-planned fires against every significant German position identified through extensive reconnaissance and aerial photography. The systematic destruction of communication systems, command posts, and defensive works eliminated German coordination capabilities, while preparing the way for infantry and armored assaults that would complete the breakthrough to Berlin. The first Soviet infantry assault commenced at 0535 hours when elements of the 3rd Shock Army began crossing the Oder River using assault boats and amphibious vehicles under cover of continuing artillery fires. The German defensive positions that survived the preliminary bombardment engaged the crossing attempts with small arms and automatic weapons, but the overwhelming numbers of attacking troops and supporting fires made effective resistance impossible. Soviet engineers quickly established pontoon bridges to support follow-up forces and heavy equipment. Colonel General Vasily Zhukov, commanding the 8th Guards Army, coordinated the breakthrough operations against Seelow Heights with methodical precision based on extensive experience in urban warfare gained during the Battle of Stalingrad. Zhukov's systematic approach to assault operations emphasized overwhelming firepower concentration followed by rapid exploitation by armored forces, tactics that had proven effective throughout the Soviet advance from the Volga to the Oder River. Weber witnessed the systematic collapse of German defensive positions as Soviet forces established multiple crossing points along the Oder River while advancing through gaps created by the artillery preparation. The Ninth Army's defensive line disintegrated rapidly under coordinated assault by overwhelming enemy forces supported by close air support and continuing artillery fires. The tactical situation confirmed Weber's assessment that German forces faced systematic annihilation rather than temporary tactical setbacks. The Soviet First Guards Tank Army began crossing the Oder River at 0630 hours using heavy pontoon bridges constructed by engineer units under artillery protection. The appearance of T-34/85 tanks and IS-3 heavy tanks in the German rear areas marked the transition from breakthrough to exploitation operations. Weber recognized that the presence of Soviet armored formations behind German defensive positions meant that the Ninth Army faced systematic encirclement and destruction. General Busse attempted to coordinate counterattacks using his army's reserve units, but the breakdown of communication systems and overwhelming Soviet firepower made effective coordination impossible. The Ninth Army possessed limited anti-tank weapons capable of stopping Soviet heavy armor, while the absence of German air support eliminated any possibility of disrupting enemy exploitation operations. Busse's tactical experience suggested that his forces could not survive sustained assault by the massive Soviet concentration attacking Seelow Heights. The systematic Soviet advance toward Berlin developed rapidly as armored spearheads penetrated German rear areas with minimal resistance, cutting communication lines and supply routes that connected defensive positions with higher headquarters. The speed and coordination of Red Army operations demonstrated tactical competence that had been refined through 4 years of warfare against Wehrmacht forces, while the overwhelming material superiority eliminated any possibility of effective German resistance. Weber and the survivors of his observation section attempted to withdraw towards secondary defensive positions, but the systematic destruction of German coordination capabilities made organized retreat impossible. The overwhelming Soviet superiority in numbers, equipment, and firepower had created tactical conditions that prevented effective defensive operations while ensuring maximum German casualties. Weber's survival depended on individual initiative rather than unit coordination or command direction. Lieutenant General Helmut Weidling, commanding the LVI Panzer Corps, recognized that his forces faced systematic destruction as Soviet breakthrough operations eliminated defensive positions throughout his sector. Weidling attempted to coordinate withdrawal operations toward Berlin's outer defenses, but the speed of Soviet advance and breakdown of German communication systems made effective command and control impossible. The systematic Red Army success demonstrated operational capabilities that exceeded German defensive resources. The encirclement of major German units began developing during the afternoon of April 16 when Soviet armored spearheads linked up behind Wehrmacht positions, trapping thousands of troops in pockets that could not be supplied or reinforced. The systematic nature of Soviet operations demonstrated operational planning that addressed both breakthrough and exploitation phases of the offensive, while the mathematical concentration of combat power eliminated German escape options. Weber escaped the initial encirclement by joining a small group of survivors who abandoned their equipment and attempted to reach German lines through forest terrain unsuitable for Soviet mechanized forces. The march toward Berlin lasted 3 days through territory dominated by Red Army forces and German deserters who controlled most of the approaches to the capital. Weber's survival demonstrated individual resourcefulness, but his escape could not change the broader tactical situation facing German forces. The liberation of concentration camps by advancing Soviet forces revealed the systematic nature of Nazi war crimes while providing additional motivation for Red Army troops advancing toward Berlin. The discovery of mass graves and systematic extermination facilities validated Soviet propaganda about German brutality while ensuring that Soviet forces would show minimal mercy during the final assault on the Reich capital. Marshal Zhukov's First Belorussian Front advanced over 60 kilometers during the first 48 hours of the Berlin operation, demonstrating the effectiveness of breakthrough operations conducted by overwhelming force concentrations. The systematic Soviet success validated 4 years of tactical development and learning from warfare against German forces, while the mathematical superiority in personnel and equipment eliminated effective Wehrmacht resistance. Weber reached the outskirts of Berlin on April 19, reporting the systematic destruction of the Ninth Army to Wehrmacht commanders who were already documenting the magnitude of Soviet success throughout the remaining Reich territory. His first-hand observations of Red Army tactical competence and overwhelming material superiority confirmed assessments that the war's end was imminent regardless of continued German resistance. The strategic implications of the Seelow Heights breakthrough extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to ensure Soviet capture of Berlin before Western Allied forces could advance from the Elbe River. The systematic Red Army success eliminated the last major German defensive position protecting the capital while demonstrating Soviet capabilities that exceeded even optimistic pre-war projections. Adolf Hitler's response to reports of the Ninth Army's destruction reflected the systematic breakdown of Nazi decision-making during the final phase of the war. The Führer's insistence on continued resistance despite overwhelming odds demonstrated political inflexibility that prevented rational military planning while ensuring maximum casualties among remaining German forces. The human cost of the Seelow Heights operation included approximately 33,000 Soviet casualties and 12,000 German dead during 3 days of fighting, representing the systematic price of breakthrough operations against prepared defensive positions. The Red Army's willingness to accept heavy casualties reflected determination to capture Berlin regardless of tactical costs, while German losses eliminated the last effective resistance between Soviet forces and the Reich capital. Weber spent the final weeks of the war serving with hastily organized Volkssturm units attempting to defend Berlin's approaches, but the systematic Soviet advance made effective resistance impossible. His combat experience provided valuable knowledge for training civilian volunteers, while his survival offered continuity with the professional military competence that had characterized German forces despite strategic defeat. The tactical lessons learned during the Berlin operation influenced Soviet military doctrine for post-war development and potential operations against Western powers. The systematic coordination between artillery, infantry, and armored forces demonstrated effective combined arms operations on an unprecedented scale, while the successful breakthrough validated Soviet tactical development during 4 years of warfare. The fall of Berlin on May 2, 1945, marked the completion of the Soviet advance from Stalingrad to the Reich capital, representing the systematic destruction of German military power in Europe. The Red Army's success demonstrated tactical competence that had evolved from the disasters of 1941 into professional military capability that exceeded German defensive resources despite continued individual heroism by Wehrmacht personnel. The intelligence failure that contributed to German underestimation of Soviet capabilities reflected broader problems affecting Nazi strategic assessment throughout the final phase of the war. The systematic dismissal of Red Army improvements combined with unrealistic assessment of German defensive capabilities created conditions that enabled Soviet forces to achieve overwhelming tactical success despite obvious preparation indicators. Weber's recognition that Berlin was lost when he observed Soviet Katyusha rockets positioning for the Seelow Heights assault proved accurate, as the systematic German collapse during the Berlin operation eliminated effective resistance throughout the Reich capital within 16 days. His intuitive understanding of the tactical situation reflected combat experience that enabled recognition of military realities despite political pressure for continued resistance. The legacy of the Berlin operation extended beyond immediate military considerations to influence post-war European political arrangements and the beginning of the Cold War. The systematic Soviet success ensured communist control over Eastern Europe while demonstrating Red Army capabilities that would influence Western military planning for decades. The operational results validated Soviet strategic planning while confirming the fundamental shift in European power relationships. The destruction of the Ninth Army at Seelow Heights represented the final major Wehrmacht tactical defeat of World War II, eliminating the last barrier protecting Berlin while confirming Soviet military supremacy over German forces. The systematic nature of Red Army's success demonstrated tactical evolution that had transformed the Soviet military from the disorganized force of 1941 into a professional organization capable of conducting complex operations against experienced opponents. Weber's survival of the Berlin operation enabled him to witness the systematic collapse of Nazi Germany during the final weeks of the war. His combat experience provided perspective on the military evolution that had occurred during 4 years of warfare, while his observations documented the human dimension of strategic defeat. Weber's personal story represented thousands of individual experiences during the systematic destruction of German military power. The morning of April 16, 1945, when Weber first observed Katyusha rocket launchers positioning for the assault on Seelow Heights, marked the beginning of the final chapter of the European War. The systematic preparation and execution of the Berlin operation demonstrated Soviet tactical competence that would prove decisive during the assault on the Reich capital, while Weber's recognition of impending disaster reflected the reality that individual courage could not overcome the mathematical advantages held by Red Army forces. The Seelow Heights breakthrough validated 4 years of Soviet learning from warfare against German forces while demonstrating the effectiveness of overwhelming material superiority properly applied through professional military competence. The systematic Red Army success eliminated the last major defensive barrier protecting Berlin while ensuring Soviet political control over the German capital. Weber's assessment that Berlin was lost proved accurate as the mathematical realities of modern warfare overcame individual heroism and political determination. The final phase of the European War demonstrated that military success required not only courage and professional competence but also adequate resources and realistic strategic planning. The systematic Soviet victory at Seelow Heights represented the culmination of tactical development that had transformed the Red Army into the most effective military force in Europe, while German defeat illustrated the consequences of strategic overreach and resource exhaustion that characterized Nazi military planning throughout the war.